This happened 3 years ago, and I still have nightmares about it. My mother came to stay with me for a week, which I knew would be a challenge. We could hardly stand to be in the same room as one another, so fighting was inevitable. On the 5th night of her stay, we got into a heated debate, and it somehow tuned into a screaming match. About an hour into it, I almost had a mini panic attack because of all the conflict. I grabbed my keys from the key rack by the door and took off. In hindsight, it wasn't the wisest thing to do, but I was so frazzled that I didn't know what else to do. I ended up sobbing my eyes out and just driving. This went on and off for about an hour, and I drove out of town. Driving had always calmed me down, so even after the tears subsided, I kept going. About another hour later, I saw an exit for a dam, which surprised me. I had lived here for 2 years, and I had no idea there was a dam anywhere close by. I decided to take a look. Even though it was 3 a.m. and pitch black, I still wasn't ready to head back, and this seemed like a good distraction at the time. It was another 30 miles on a desolate road before I finally reached the dam. It was hard to miss because it was the only light I had seen for miles. I crossed the dam and saw that there were a couple turns leading to campsites, and at this point, the lake came into view. I decided to turn around and go back to a little parking area I had seen near the dam. Once there, I parked, and this is when my night took a terrifying turn. I parked and rolled down my windows, and I could hear the sound of water hitting a shore, but in the light of my headlights, I couldn't see where it was coming from. The mosquitoes were pretty bad, so I rolled my window back up and started fishing around in my back seat for a flashlight that I knew I had somewhere in the car. Then I remembered that I had it in my trunk. This was the sequence of events that followed. I popped the trunk, turned off my car, opened the door, stepped out, closed the door, got the flashlight, closed the trunk, went back to the door just to find that it was locked. I still had the key in the ignition, so I knew I was in trouble because I was locked out. Instantly, tears started to well up because I knew I hadn't even bothered taking my phone with me. I panicked for a while, but then I remembered the campsites I had seen, and I hoped that maybe someone would be in one and that they would have a phone I could borrow. I started walking towards it and began thinking about having to wake up some poor stranger in the middle of the night, but I didn't see any other options. Each campsite I came to was completely empty. I think I had checked around 15 or so before I started to get nervous about how far I wandered from my car. I had walked about a mile, and on the walk back, my battery started to fade on the flashlight. I was only about halfway back, so my panic reached a whole new level. For whatever reason, the parking area and my car seemed like a safe haven, and so I started sprinting. In my panic, and with my senses confused in the darkness, I got switched around somewhere and ended up in a dead-end campsite, even though I could have sworn that I was still on the main road. This was when the major tears started. I panicked even more and ended up in yet another campsite. It felt like I was just getting more and more lost, and I couldn't hear the water anymore. It began to feel like a maze with no escape, so I calmed myself down and decided to stay put until morning, which I knew wasn't too long of a wait. I sat down, wrapped my arms around my legs, and proceeded to try and rock myself into calmness. It worked pretty well until I saw him. I had my eyes closed, but then I heard a dull footstep. I looked up, obviously startled, and saw him standing only a few feet away. He was massive, probably about 6'4", and had a large build, just like a football player. In hindsight, I don't know how I didn't hear him approach me sooner. For a second, all I could do was stare in horror and gasp incomprehensible words. Then I screamed. It only took him a second to close the distance between us, but I didn't even have time to properly get up before he had his hand around my throat. He began to choke me. Compared to him, I was nothing more than a little rag doll. I wasn't even sure of what was happening, but I was being jerked around by the neck and arm. His hands were huge, and it felt like he would snap something. When the movement stopped, I was in his lap with my head pressed against his chest, and one of his legs was partially crossed over me. He was half cradling me, half grappling me. I was too dazed to make a sound, but when I tried, his hand would tighten over my throat. He smelled rancid, like beer, and something decomposing. I struggled to get free again, but this time he pinched my esophagus between his thumb and forefinger. It was light at first, but then he started increasing the pressure. By the time he was done, I felt like I was going to pass out. I gave up on trying to scream or get away. I sat there and simply sobbed. Then, possibly even more disturbing, he started to hum and rock me. I'm not sure why this part bothered me so much, but it did. His voice seemed higher than it should have been, and his hum was rather nasally. I don't know how to describe it. Then, just as his humming was becoming almost frantic sounding, I saw headlights, and he stopped. Somewhere in the distance, it looked as if a car was heading our way. He also saw it, and I felt panic well up inside of me, worried that he would drag me off somewhere, but he didn't. He simply let me go, stood up and walked the opposite way into the trees. Without him supporting me, I fell back slightly and watched him walk off. The sun wasn't up fully yet, but there was enough light to make out more of him than I had been able to before. He looked as bad as he smelled. Dirty, saggy jeans, a white hoodie that was so stained that it looked brownish gray, and medium-length brown matted hair. I didn't see his face at all, because I had kept my eyes shut for the entire time he had me. I could hear the car getting closer, and I stood up. My flashlight was about 30 feet away, which was where I had been initially sitting. Only then did I realize how far he had taken me while he pulled me around like a doll. I could see the car lights through the trees, but they suddenly took a left turn and panic instantly set in. I was worried that he would come back if he saw that the car wasn't coming to this campsite. I started to run. I didn't even care about staying on a path or road, just as long as I could still see the car. I caught myself on a few bushes and scraped myself falling a few times, but the pain didn't even register. I was too desperate to care. I don't know how long I had ran for, but eventually the people in the car noticed me. It was a couple. They stopped and the guy had gotten out. I dropped to the floor as the realization of what could have happened hit me like a ton of bricks. Even before I could tell them what happened, the girlfriend had called the police. Everything after that seems like a blur now. The couple drove to the parking area as told to do by the cops, just in case the man was still around. The sheriff's department showed up, took me to the nearest station, asked for statement, checked me for evidence, and contacted the fire department to break into my car for me. My mom and friend eventually arrived at the station, and just after that, a sheriff's car pulled up. The man was in the back seat. I was promptly pulled back inside and asked to make a positive identification. As I looked up at him, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked ashamed, confused, and oddly vulnerable, and then his eyes started to tear up. I knew something had to be wrong with him mentally, and in a weird way, I actually began to feel sympathy for him. I confirmed that it was him, and at this point, my sympathy flew out the window. He was indeed mentally unstable, and the sheriff informed me that he was also a convicted sex offender. Looking back, it seems more like a dream. The entire drive back, my mom and friend kept grilling me for more information, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I still don't like talking about it, and I refuse to ever go camping. As far as the guy goes, he was admitted into a psych hospital, and I hope he remains there.
Watch another if you dare.